Tonight, tonight's guest is Lindsey Boylan, a Democratic candidate for Manhattan Borough President. Lindsey has devoted much of her career to public service. In addition to positions on community boards 5 and 7, Lindsey has served as a member of the Board of Trustees of Wellesley College, her alma mater, and the Director of Business Affairs for the Bryant Park Corporation. While Director of Business Affairs, Lindsey devoted her time to urban planning, overseeing Bryant Park, Herald and Greeley Squares, and the pedestrianization of Broadway and other public spaces in Manhattan. Lindsey also served as Deputy Secretary of Economic Development and Housing for the state of New York, where she oversaw the state's chief economic development agency and, among other things, helped secure millions of dollars for underfunded public housing. Today, Lindsey is a Democratic candidate for Manhattan Borough President. I'm really looking forward to hearing her dig into the issues tonight. So it's my pleasure to introduce Democratic Manhattan Borough President candidate, Lindsey Boylan.
My apologies. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
No worries. It's great to see you, and it's great to have you on our forum. Wonderful to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The process went well.
Yes, absolutely. It was, and it was exciting to just turn in those petitions. We've got more than enough, more than a buffer. It's surreal to know that that's the step in getting on the ballot. So it's very exciting.
Wonderful. Well, that's great to hear. And so you will be on the ballot, I presume. And we're going to jump right into the issues, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Right. Today, the media has reported that after months of negotiations, years really, a deal has been struck in Albany to legalize cannabis for adult use, often referred to as recreational use. I'm not going to ask you about the finer elements of the proposed legislation because the truth is we really don't know what each provision states. But what would you regard as the most important elements of an adult use program in New York?
I think it's one where the revenues from the program go to restorative justice and to try and attempt to undo some of the harms of the war on drugs, which I grew up amidst. I think that's really important. I understand that that's a provision of the legislation in terms of community funding that will be the focus of the tax revenue. I think that's really important. I think that's the most important thing. And I do also think it was very important. I understand in the latest conversations that the smell of marijuana has long been used as a device for the police departments to NYPD, the police departments to gain access to and search someone. And that is, as I understand it, been stripped from the latest legislation. I think that's really important. It should not be part and parcel to, we shouldn't have police officers still doing that. And I think that's really important.
Well, that actually, you actually anticipated my next question, which was if that provision were still left in the bill, because as part of the governor's package, it would be left in the bill.
Of course.
If that were to be left in the bill, would that be a deal breaker for you?
I think it's a real poison pill for the intention of the law, which we just discussed, which was, in my view, it very much. First of all, I think it's a long time coming to legalize marijuana for recreational use. Other states have done it safely, and I would venture so far to say that casual recreational marijuana use has fewer negative externalities than a lot of legal drugs and addictive substances, just as an aside. And I think the idea that we would leave in place and basically reinforce the notion that police officers can focus on people based on legal recreational drug use is a poison pill, because it goes against everything in part that we're trying to achieve, particularly with respect to restorative justice and ending the war on drugs, which has penalized low-income and communities of color from the beginning. So it would be, I don't want to say no, but I am hopeful that the governor will again be defeated on this front. And that's the latest that I'm hearing. And so I think it's really important that provision, the idea that police officers would still be able to search based off of the scent of marijuana is very much problematic, and it can't be part of the bill. That becomes law.
Well, we'll find out, I imagine, in the next couple of days, but it is an
Yes.
exciting moment now. New York is the 13th largest economy in the world. And to add an
Yes.
adult-use program here would really be wonderful in terms of, if nothing else, raising tax revenue to support
What, $300 million on the outset? I think it's really important. My indirect connection to some of the early precepts of this from a legislative standpoint were when I was chief of staff to the state's economic development agency and then economic development secretary. You may remember the question was legalization with, I think, 5 licenses at the state, and how those could be utilized to the end of restorative justice, which is a very big piece of, not the only piece of this. I think there are conversations to be had and important reasons for both medicinal and recreational marijuana. But we've come a long way, and I think it's far past time.
Wonderful. Well, that's great. And I'm now going to turn to the issue of housing and homelessness. Tomorrow, there's a rally that's scheduled to take place in front of the Lucerne Shelter Hotel on the Upper West Side. I know you're going to be there.
Yes.
Would you use your position as Manhattan Borough President to demand that the city continue using hotels and other temporary facilities, such as Lucerne, to provide housing, even on a temporary basis, to homeless individuals?
Yes, absolutely. A few things to unpack there. I have, as you know, been supportive of the men currently housed at the Lucerne. It was the right thing to do on many levels in the midst of a pandemic where we have people unsafely in congregate shelters. We need to move away from a model where we depend on congregate shelters that are in many ways inhumane and do not help people get a better path to stability, which is something we all need. We live in a city that, this statistic amazed me, 1 in 4 families experiencing homelessness in this country is in this city. So I think that is the most important and salient response to kind of your, like, would you fight for this? I think there's no more important fight. We can all talk about quality of life issues in terms of livability. That has nothing to do with safely housing people who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability safely in hotels. I do also believe that in this post-pandemic world, when we get there, and we are going to be confronted with a lot of questions, particularly in my job as borough president, around land use and zoning, and I think you kind of touched on that as well with respect to hotels. Let's face it, for a period of maybe a decade or so, we saw an explosive growth of hotels. And it may not in fact be the case that the economy, the tourism economy, the reality of how much has been built fits with the needs of the number of hotels that we built. And we need to have every option open to find ways to deal with our housing crisis. And so I think those two things are connected. I very much want our tourism sector to recover as well, but it's never, I'm very supportive of the men who have been experiencing homelessness at Lucerne. I'm very supportive of programs that use underutilized hotel stock and other housing stock to house people safely. And I'm very supportive of things like 146, legislative piece of 146 that increases the value of vouchers, that makes it actually possible for people to afford housing. We've missed the boat on a lot of things, and we're never going to have a livable city. We're never going to have a truly successful city when we make it impossible for so many people to have stable housing.
Well, one of the things that sometimes is lost on society and some public officials is that the solution to homelessness is housing, not more
Yes.
shelters.
Absolutely.
So to that, and the city has in the past, or I should say in the recent past, made it a feature of municipal policy to utilize private development to develop low income and other affordable housing. How attached are you to that model of using private development to create affordable housing? In other words, isn't there a way for us to handle this without incentivizing developers with these zoning bonuses and other inducements, which in the end change our municipal landscape?
Well, I think on the outset, let's just admit, which I believe, that mandatory inclusionary housing, major features of 421A, and other programs that are supposed to incentivize some affordable housing, and that's a whole nother conversation we could have been an utter failure at actually providing affordable housing and preserving affordability, reducing displacement, all of the things that it was intended to do, supposedly things like mandatory inclusionary housing, it has utterly failed at. And I think this model where we get some small ratio of affordable housing on the heels of broad luxury development is a bankrupt model. It makes no sense in this economy, and it frankly never made sense. I live in West Chelsea. I think we're, as a good example as any. When it's the evening, I'm on a Zoom like this. If we're a little darker, I would look outside, and all the apartment buildings near me would be empty in terms of no lights on, no people inside, largely. The speculative building around luxury development that has been incentivized by a lot of our tax policies and our really the power of real estate that controls this city doesn't have any place in a post-pandemic recovery, in my view. And I do think that there is absolutely a role for private actors to do all 100% affordable and affordable development. And if there is a role in incentives, it's to making that from a zoning standpoint and from, an opportunity standpoint, incentivizing that kind of development, but not basically a ratio that just bakes into the cake more displacement and more lack of affordability, which is what mandatory inclusionary housing does.
Right. And what about the idea of using an increase in our tax base, effectively increasing taxes on wealthy people, in order to help provide jobs programs and subsidies for those who have recently transitioned from homeless shelters to
Sure.
permanent housing? Would you
I'm
say
100% supportive of it. I am of the belief that we are not taxing our wealthiest enough in any number of ways.
what does wealthiest enough mean, roughly? I'm not going to try to
Oh,
pin
it's, I mean, I would rather take it piece by piece. But for one thing, I agree with things like the pied-à-terre tax. For another thing, carried interest loopholes. For another thing, a graduated tax system that actually makes the amount that our wealthiest are paying. A lot is being left on the table when we are in the middle of, I would say, an economic depression. And the crisis has only worsened our inequality in every metric. Kids who are doing poorly at school have suffered the most. Seniors who were living in poverty are now, silently, living in pain and further poverty. Every metric we have has gotten worse. And so I'm completely supportive of the broader Invest in New York movement to increase taxes on our wealthiest and also take care of a lot of the loopholes that make evading that process possible. I think it's necessary. I'm also, this is a federal issue really, but I'm supportive of a wealth tax because just a lot of the wealth capture is not revealed. It's not measured in our tax system. And, I'll go back to the age-old Adam. If we can put someone on the moon, we can figure out how to do a wealth tax that is reflective of how to do more for people. And it's just necessary, particularly when we consider housing and the climate crisis. I think our two biggest crises in this city and in this borough especially are extreme inequality. And I think in many ways, the housing crisis manifests that, most obviously, also education. And then the climate crisis. And you look at Lower Manhattan, even look at East Harlem, look at where I was in West Chelsea after Sandy, we flooded out.
Well, let's just talk. I'm going to go a little bit off my
Sure.
list here, but you just raised a couple of interesting issues for
Sure.
me. When you talk about a wealth tax, are you thinking more in terms of like Elizabeth Warren, like
Yes.
billionaires having to pay a certain percentage of their holdings, or are you thinking more of an income-based tax?
Yeah, I think yes is probably the answer to, your variety at some point. But I think the thing that we're not even, I think Amazon is a great, not the only example, but it's a great example of the tremendous, almost indescribable, incomprehensible degree to which we are missing any kind of capture of taxation for someone like Jeff Bezos. And so I do agree that some of the low-hanging fruit here, particularly in a pandemic and an economic depression like we are in, should focus first on our wealthiest. And then things like the carried interest loophole, which is particularly relevant to the metro area. But I am supportive of wealth tax, and that's why in this last presidential cycle, I was very much of the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren support base, and I think it's an interesting arc even for my own life, because I was the jobs secretary for the state of New York, and it's not in conflict with that to me, because what did any of these big companies want to know about when they decided to invest in and try and hire employees from New York? What's the quality of life? What is life like if you have to try and afford an apartment? What is life like if if your kids are trying to navigate New York City schools? What is life like? These things really matter. And so I think we've been on a long, several decade losing battle for a while with respect to, everything from corporate power and politics, Citizens United, all of it. But we got to get real. I mean, particularly with respect to something like Amazon as a company and Jeff Bezos as an individual. This is really an organization that has been built on the backs of underpaying workers and frankly responding to people's pain points. Now, there are ways to do this that might actually hurt people the most, and that's not what we want. I think there's been lots of conversations around added tax for deliveries in Amazon. I don't want to hurt the single mom who's getting diapers delivered. I don't want to hurt someone who's only access to getting food delivered because they're immunocompromised and they're living alone. We have to do these things thoughtfully, but they have to be done, because it's almost incalculable, the extreme inequality that we have, and we feel that in a city like New York more than anywhere else, I would say.
Should developers that construct these super tall towers based upon variances be required to pay a height tax?
Yes, I mean, they shouldn't even be allowed to. That building on the Upper West Side that Olive and so many others have fought against shouldn't have been out. The shaft. I'm trying to remember the right terminology for it, but basically evading the rules to build a super tall.
It was a tax.
Yeah, it's unethical. It goes against the spirit of the law, which is there to protect communities and protect people. And I think it should be, I think they should have to deal with that and take it down.
But any variance and the pandemic has created a wealth of opportunities for us to
but
adjust.
I feel bad. I'm sorry.
No worries at all. So I was actually just about to close out that discussion point and get into the New York Public Library. A number of our viewers are very interested in what's going on at the New York Public Library. About 7 years ago, then public advocate Bill de Blasio urged New Yorkers to support him because he claimed that he would prevent the privatization of public assets, which had become a central feature of the Bloomberg administration. A prime example of this was the New York Public Library, where the Bloomberg administration was advocating for elimination of the stacks. And as a result, it was really looking as a clearing ground for weddings and corporate events to fill the New York Public Library. And during the de Blasio administration, even before COVID, the number of hours for the library went from 80 to 56. And Sunday hours were completely scaled back. Saturday hours were eliminated. Critics contend that this has really privatized the New York Public Library, whereas those who support it are saying, we need the money because the New York Public Library doesn't have funding to do the job. So where do you stand on this? Do you think that we should be allowing the New York Public Library to be privatized to a certain degree to allow for sufficient funding? Or should we be finding another way for us to provide funding to the New York Public Library?
No, I do not agree with the continued privatization of New York Public Library. Maybe my access point here is maybe a little interesting for some of the folks in our library advocacy community. So I manage Bryant Park. My first serious responsibility was the lawn, over which the stacks are. And it's basically like a giant kitty litter box in terms of irrigation, and it's very stressful to manage. But so my moving to New York, most of my 20s was spent basically surrounded by the public library, the main branch of the Manhattan Public Library, that was in many ways like rebranded as the Schwartzman Library, which I think is not the direction we should continue to go in. We should not go into the continued direction of privatization of what I believe is probably one of our most important assets in the city and in the state. Think about how this pandemic for kids, for vaccination, for seniors, for any number of community residents, how different it could have been if we had fully invested libraries that really continue to serve unfettered as the community assets that they are. And I understand these are difficult times from a budgetary standpoint, but I see few things that are more important than our libraries. And it's a grave concern to me. I mean, think about kids trying to get access to Wi-Fi. Think about after-school programming. Think about how we could have coordinated vaccination education or any number of things if we had put the amount of thought and investment and support into our library branch system as the governor put into, reopening the Buffalo Bills Stadium after the pandemic. I don't want to be glib about it, but I think we've now witnessed, and I would say my entire adulthood was witnessing and experiencing this corporatization and privatization of a lot of our public spaces and a lot of our assets. And I think that is not the way forward for a city that has only become more extremely unequal.
So as a borough president, would you advocate for the restoration of the 80-hour open hours a week for the library?
Yes. The amount of isolation and loneliness that people have, the amount of fear that they have, the lack of community connection for a lot of our young people. Is there a better connecting point than our libraries and ones that are full functioning and operating when we limit the hours? Like when I managed a public park, that when people can't consistently depend on a public space or a public asset, that they start to not depend on it at all. And this is the cannibalization of our library system, I would say. So yes, I absolutely will. And I will make myself a nuisance in whatever way I have to be.
Wonderful. Let's turn to the issue of landmark preservation. Right now, if work is proposed to a property adjacent to a designated landmark, the Landmarks Preservation Commission has stated that it may not have the jurisdiction to grant or deny or modify building permits, because if the building is adjacent to the landmark, but the building itself that's subject to the construction is not actually designated property, the Landmarks Preservation can take position. We don't have authority to do anything. And even when they do have authority, sometimes they suggest that it's limited. For example, the Grand Central Terminal, adjacent to the Grand Central Terminal, is right now is a hotel, and what they're looking to do is construct a 1,600-foot tall hotel next door.
Yep.
And as a consequence, people are concerned the Grand Central Terminal may be in some way harmed by the project. Similarly, in the Merchants House Museum, right next door to the Merchants House Museum on East 4th Street, they're thinking about putting up a building next door, and if they do that, it's entirely possible that the Merchants House Museum may be structurally compromised.
Yes.
Do you believe that the Landmarks Preservation Commission should have the power to have an effect on, either to modify or to reject, a proposed building permit if the grant of that permit would result in damage to adjacent?
Yes. Now, landmarks preservation process has all of these intricacies that are problematic. I think they've largely served certain communities, predominantly white ones. So this does not go unaffected, but I absolutely believe so. In fact, I was just in Chinatown with the Chinatown Working Group, which explained, I didn't know this, there's only one landmark building, I believe, in all of Chinatown. And one of the concerns that I heard there and have heard voiced in other occasions is that one of the problems with the landmarking process is that it as soon as you start to pursue that, you create an area around a building that is it's a real problem from either preservation standpoint. It's a very scary road trying to preserve things while you're in the process of trying to preserve them. And I do believe that we have to modify that process.
Should we consider using eminent domain on properties that are adjacent to sensitive and fragile landmark structures?
The problem, so, and I hear eminent domain talked about a lot, and you're a lawyer, so I don't want to get into legalese when I'm not a lawyer. But my experience being chief of staff of a state agency that did have eminent domain powers is that is kind of its own morass and takes years as well, and a lot of legal barriers to that might not actually have the intended outcome that we're talking about. I think there are a lot of, it's not that I'm against it necessarily, I don't think it's the best way to pursue this in terms of, I do agree that if we're talking about a landmarks preservation process for a specific building, you can't think of these things in isolation, and the adjacent buildings and the adjacent land use and the adjacent planning has an implication. And I think if I had a critique that I hear a lot from people, it's that too much of our planning process, our upzoning or rezoning processes take an area or a community in a vacuum without considering the context. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. I don't think eminent domain is the right solution here or in most cases for any number of logistical reasons and beyond. But yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, eminent domain is, as you point out, a complicated area, but I think people are just looking for ways.
Some way to fight it. I get it. And I think if there's anything people may know about me now, I am a fighter, and I'm creative in terms of where we need to think about taking the fight, and so I'm all for that fight. So I just don't think that the eminent domain approach is the kind of what do you call it, like Holy Grail or whatever you want to call it, the Rosetta Stone or whatever it would be. I don't think that is what people think it is, personally, from my experience of large scale projects that have either been in courtrooms in legal battles because of eminent domain and because of the scale of the kinds of projects that usually end up being confronted with eminent domain.
Okay, so speaking of context, let's talk about the Board of Standards and Appeals. For those people, the Board of Standards and Appeals is effectively the New York City zoning board. The Board of Standards and Appeals currently grants over 95% of applications for zoning variances by real estate developers.
Which I didn't realize that. It's kind of ludicrous. It's kind of really ludicrous.
The exception effectively has become the rule. And critics of the BSA contend that the approval rate is reflective of institutional bias in favor of developers. Developers say, no, it's just that the BSA is actually weeding out the bad applications, so the ones that come through.
I think that's bullshit, personally. Excuse my language, but I don't agree with that. I think that's bullshit.
Listen, I think a good cuss word every once in a while.
Yeah.
There's someplace the BSA seems like the best place. Well, let me ask you this: a proposal's been floated for which at least one mayoral candidate has expressed support, and that's adding 2 floating members of the Board of Standards and Appeals. Representatives from the communities that would be affected by the decisions would come in and be added basically to the 5-person board. So you'd have 7, 2 from the community, and the rest would be appointees from the mayor. That way, communities and neighborhoods would play an increased role in decision-making,
Yes.
having a vote, but not necessarily giving them veto power so that NIMBYists, people who say not in my backyard, could simply veto all zoning decisions. Would you, as borough president, advocate for adding 2 or more seats to the BSA to include local community involvement so that
Yes,
they vote on.
yes, yes, yes. And let's, even, I don't, even good policies and practices that have a real justification for their inception, unabated, there are always powers that find a way to abuse a system, even when it is not set up to be abused. And so I do believe, even, let's say we do this and we find that there are other ways around, that real estate developers find other ways around this, or who gets appointed in these floating memberships doesn't work.
Right.
I think the end goal is to find a way to make the reality something other than developers get what they want in this city. And I think it is true that they do and have. I mean, when I joined Community Board 7, I moved to New York City, lived on 85th and Center Park West in Columbus, and joined under Helen Rosenthal, and Gail was my council member. My memory of ULURP processes and all kinds of development processes was just that developers got what they wanted. Even in an area that probably has more political power than anywhere else in Manhattan, I would say. I mean, arguably, but I think that's probably right. And that was my experience as just a kid who didn't really know how things worked in the city. And we've got to disrupt that. And I think the Board of Estimate is part of that.
I was going to say, speaking of community boards, by the way, do you think they should, now that, I actually, you're the first person I think I have on my program that's served on a community board. I did as well. At one point. Do you think that we need to, in some way, reform our community board process, the selection process, or what their powers are?
Yes. So let's start with I served on CB7, and then I had moved 9 times in 10 years. So I stopped serving when I moved to a different area, transient life of a kid who moves to New York City. And then I was on CB5 as a public member when I managed Bryant Park and other public spaces, because that's basically CB5, is all these public spaces in the heart of the city and, the central business district. So those are the 2 I was engaged with. Community boards are incredibly important, and they have a central role to play, not only in the city's future, but in my success when I win. So let's just say that right there. Incredibly important. What I have observed is that a lot of our community board members and our community board leaders feel like they work for city council members, or they feel like they work for assembly members, or they work for the mayor. I think the whole system, where even things like member deference, even things like, well, what does my council member, and mine is the city council speaker, Corey Johnson, what does my council member want me as a CB4 member to do so that I make them happy? What a warped process. So there's that, which is so wrong. If I get this job, I work for you, not the other way around. And I think the appointments process has been used by politicians to stack things in their favor and to validate their power base. And I think that's really wrong. So that has to end. I do think, every crisis presents an opportunity. I do believe that the nature of remote meetings and Zoom, as much as I was out for a few minutes, we have problems with it. Think about the number of people who can engage that weren't able to before. I mean, I got a 7-year-old kid, she's sitting right over there. I know a lot of single moms who they can't go to a meeting, every week in person, but they could maybe do it remotely and try to come sometimes in person. People who who are immunocompromised or have mobility issues or have the kind of schedule that prevents them from engaging. That's any number of kinds of jobs across the spectrum and lives and issues. We need to take from this challenging time and build from the ability to engage remotely and to use people's time as respectfully as possible. It's not just that people should be able to engage remotely. It's that even, if you're not a member, if you're just speaking up on an issue. I spoke up against, it was 250 Water Street in a planning meeting or something. I waited. Luckily, I had a team. I got a team. I'm running for office. Our team waited like 8 hours just for me to get the moment to say the thing that I had prepared, days in advance. And they never called my name. So after all that, like they called it, but then I wasn't ever elevated to the stage, whatever it was. That is, we talk about voter suppression. That's voter, not just voter suppression, that's community voice suppression. And I think It's not always malicious. It's not necessarily always macabre. It's just a lot of things can go wrong in the operational management of community engagement. And I think that that is a big challenge and opportunity for me to fix. And, you know, maybe something people know about me, even if they don't know a lot, is that I'm unafraid to challenge even my peers in politics. And sometimes that doesn't make you everyone's best friend. And the only way I'm going to be successful is if I empower community boards that are truly representative of our communities to make decisions that benefit our communities. Like, that's, if I'm not always making friends, if I'm lighting some fires somewhere else, the only way I'm going to be successful at helping our communities is if I elevate other people's voices. And the way to do that primarily is community boards and genuine engagement and amplifying what people want instead of what I want. So I think it's really important.
Absolutely. You talked a lot about remote participation. Just to be clear, though, you're not suggesting that we would replace in-person
No.
advocacy with remote, just sort of as a supplementation. I hear what you're saying. Is that right?
Yeah. I think we always want to have that in-person engagement. But I'll give you an example.
Would you agree that in-person advocacy is an important element
Yes.
of supporting
Yes.
positions?
Let's talk about what I think is a very fair frustration that a lot of our community advocates have about some of these zoning processes, particularly like Gowanus, which I don't know all the specifics because I'm focusing my life on Manhattan. But people say, how can you say this is a genuine engagement process with our community when a lot of people can't engage? And so there are all these issues presented by remote engagement that make it impossible for a lot of people to engage. I'm just saying we need to enable people to engage this way as a part of a more robust community engagement process in person.
If you're relying purely on remote, there are some places, for example, where people don't have access to the internet. Not everybody has a computer.
Yes, which goes back to libraries, everything. No, it will never be a replacement, but boy, wouldn't it be great to continue to build off the engagement and the people we didn't have engaged before for reasons beyond their control, because we made it possible for them to stay engaged, even if it's remotely, or even if it's, how do we not penalize people for, I have a former colleague from state service who has, significant mobility issues, and particularly when we have inclement weather, there's no reason that this person should have to, show up in the office. But right. In a pre-COVID world, that was all it was. It was that, well, this is your fault, not mine. This is on you to fix. And, I think we have observed that a lot can get done. More people's voices can be heard. It can never be a replacement because, as you've said, it has its own inequalities. But that is a way to add the number of people who can engage and should.
So as Borough President, just to be clear, and then I want to get to the next issue, but you would oppose any legislation that would exclude in-person activity?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, that's not the way forward, particularly when we're talking about significant planning changes. That's another piece. Like, you need to center in person, but it shouldn't penalize people who can't participate in person. How do we engage them as well?
So I have one last minute question I got before we started, and I want to be able to ask it because the person always checks in. And here's the question. On congestion pricing, while the law was approved in 2019, its implementation has been deferred, but at some point it's going to go into full effect, at which point there's a concern that property values in affected areas may decline. One such homeowner wrote about a concern that our apartments' value may go down precipitously. Would you support subsidies, grants, or other incentives to people who live in areas that are adversely affected by congestion pricing in order to ensure that property values don't drop?
Sure. So I am a supporter of congestion pricing for any number of reasons. I believe a city that is focused on pedestrians, mass transit, not getting rid of cars, but disincentivizing their use when unnecessary is the way to go. And the tax revenue is important, particularly to support our struggling mass transit system. So I'll say that. the concerns I've heard more, and we have examples. London has gone through this, and you know, there's always growing pains with respect to these kinds of programs. There was growing pains along Second Avenue when the Second Avenue subway station was going on. There have been growing pains with respect to the L in Brooklyn and how it affects small businesses and the like. I do support subsidies that are going to help individuals most affected by any interim problems that congestion pricing brings. I pause simply because I have not seen the data to support that congestion pricing actually hurts home value. And I don't want to dismiss someone's concern. That's not where I'm at, but I just want to pause to say that. What I have heard is, Lindsey, we know you like congestion pricing. We think you care about what we need and you're here to support us. But I need my car in the Lower East Side. Accessibility isn't great near my block. I need to have it. And you're going to make it so much more expensive for me to either use my car or to get a cab or to all these other issues. There are real issues that have to be worked out. And I think the only kind of good leader is one who's going to try and respond to those in the short term as well as the long term. So I'm here for it. I pause at talking about subsidies to homeowners for any number of reasons, one of which is, I'd say the most salient. I'm not sure that we have the data to say that it actually hurts home value.
Right. Well, one thing that I've noticed over the course of the last 10 years is that real estate taxes in New York have gone up dramatically. My real estate taxes have more than doubled. Yes. And I would attribute that to the decline of the commercial tax base. FIDI, which used to be a vibrant commercial den of activity, has become a real estate, residential area.
Yes.
And the more we lose commercial tax base, the more we end up looking more like Pelham and other areas of Westchester, which don't have the commercial tax base to support the projects that they need to support. So I guess my question for you is, as borough president, what policies would you advocate to try to retain as much commercial tax base in New York as possible so that we don't have to raise revenue from homeowners like the person who wrote about the fact their property values are going down?
Yes. Well, I think that's a huge struggle we have. I like to walk around the borough a lot. I started my career and have been in some way, shape, or form in urban planning for its entirety. So I love walking around the city, and retail is really suffering. I'd say all of commercial is really suffering. And I don't even think we've seen the real numbers on that, because I think people are trying to make it look less bad than it is. I think the biggest thing that I have control over as borough president, there's a lot at the state level when we talk about taxes, and particularly commercial and residential taxes. All of that, as viewers know, is tied to Albany. But I've heard two things that are probably really relevant. I've heard this kind of what you just said, kind of hard to predict people getting untenable real estate taxes and having no rhyme or reason really associated with that, and not being able to take it on alongside a lot of other difficulties. So I think that is a real concern that I have to figure out how to advocate for. But the thing I can do directly, and frankly what I spent most of my career doing, particularly before I worked for the state, was even when I was the economic development secretary, is how do I support small businesses particularly? How do I support retail? How do I use any of the $100 million in capital money I'll have as borough president? How do I incentivize all and deploy all of my staff to make it easier for small businesses to stay in business? Why are they failing? And I'm focusing on small business here because the decisions that JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Amex are going to make about employing big numbers of people have a lot of factors beyond the borough president's control. But I have a lot to say about creating a livable city, creating a livable borough, and creating an environment that enables particularly small businesses to stay in business. And what?
You're supporting mom and pops, mom and pops.
Yeah, I think that's where I need to focus my time because no one else is. And so a few things I've heard that are scary, because it's always good to be a little scary. And, most of the businesses particularly with the retail front and small businesses that I've heard have failed in this pandemic, even ones that got PPP money, ones that got emergency aid, failed because they couldn't get through the Rubicon or whatever you want to call it with their rent or their lease situation. And that was really the albatross that sunk them. And I'm hearing this a lot. And I think there are a number of responses to that, but I have to own that and figure out how to navigate out of that. There are going to be opportunities with the level of closures, for new people. I've got a lot of friends who are like, well, now is the time that maybe I can grow and have a space and a women-run business and all that. How do I help the struggling businesses, both in legislation that I may support at the city council level, in capital money that I may support to help revitalize or create a more livable environment around these anchor businesses? How do I, and I did this at the state in part, not alone, obviously, but when I was chief of staff, we at ESD, the state's economic development agency, we oversaw small business services one-stop shop. So how do we help all of the ways that we need to small businesses navigate tough environments? And we need to do that.
And you would draw on, I assume you would draw on the relationships you've established over the
Yes.
years with the
Yes.
corporation in order to help provide the funding and grants that would be necessary.
Yeah, I mean, and when you think about it, even a lot of the small business money, CDFIs, all of these things that go into small businesses, minority and women-owned businesses, we have the most aggressive program, and I, as chief of staff, oversaw that when I was at the state. A lot of them deal with federal money. That's the other thing we haven't talked about here is we're going to get a lot of federal aid. We're going to be in an environment where we have a contentious relationship with this governor and whoever the mayor is. We just know it. I know it. And that person is going to be spending a lot of their time fighting battles with Albany in Albany. Right. How can I be chief advocate for what is going to be most useful for small businesses in Manhattan? And it sounds selfish maybe, but at the end of the day, let's not forget this is the central business district for not just the whole city, but for the whole state. So any failure of Manhattan, any lack of recovery in Manhattan is extremely problematic for the state as a whole. And I will take that battle wherever I need to make sure that's understood and reflected in resource allocation. And that's part of the short-term game as well.
Well, you mentioned 2 points in your last answer, which I have to pick up on in a completely unrelated topic. You mentioned the governor and battles. So right now, the governor is under investigation for sexual harassment and at least in one instance, sexual assault of female staffers. Lindsey, you were the first to come forward. And let me say that I commend you on your leadership on this issue. It could not have been easy for you to go public with your story and to expose yourself and your family to the scrutiny of challenging someone as powerful as the governor of New York. So I wanted to say that first. I'm not going to ask you about the particulars of what happened. It's not what this forum is about. But I do want to talk to you about the policy implications.
Yeah.
You could send one message to victims of sexual harassment, discrimination, or assault in the workplace. What would that message be?
It would be that whatever I have to do, I'm going to make it easier for you to come forward, because it's only if you come forward, not by revealing your name, but by speaking your truth about your experience and holding people in power accountable. It's only if more of us do that, that things will truly change by the time my daughter is my age. And abuse of power is really what's at play here. And it's destructive. What I experienced, what other women experience is truly destructive. It derailed my life in a way. It kind of destroyed it for a little while. I'm here and I'm doing this, and this is my great passion. I'm not going to let him affect me in that way. And I want women to see that. If they're following the story, I don't want to assume people are, but I want them to see that, because I want them to know that the more we do this, the less likely abusers of power can do that to more women, and that has to change. And so I'm still doing exactly what I love, because this is what I love. And how dare anyone try to take that from us? And so I want people to feel supported to come forward. But I encountered, just the other thing I would say about this, and I know I'm answering for too long, but the amount of money one has to spend on legal bills already me, and having a platform so I can defend myself, having all these ways to kind of try and make myself safe. I am so privileged by comparison. Most people don't have all that. And it enrages me to think that how many women encounter this alone. And you can bet I really didn't want this to be part of who I am, because there was an article yesterday, didn't say my name. It just said, Andrew Cuomo accuser has an opinion about X. I don't want to be that. I want to be Lindsey Boylan. But I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make it easier for other women to come forward who don't have my level of privilege, to have a platform, to have an established career, to have the financial ability to defend myself. You would think we would have all these things as a truly modern society, and we don't. And that means we're not a truly modern society. So I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make that possible for other women.
You said other women. Do you know if there are other women besides those who have come out publicly, besides yourself and those who have been identified in the media?
Absolutely.
There are.
I worked with a person for 3 years. He doesn't know how to be appropriate to women. He doesn't know how to be appropriate to women.
Dozens of public officials on both sides of the aisle have called for the governor's resignation.
Yeah.
What would you say to those women who have come forward with allegations of sexual harassment, discrimination, and assault, not only against the governor, but against others, if the governor were able to serve out the rest of his term, notwithstanding the evidence that's been lodged against him?
Or what would it take for people like me to think it's okay for him to serve his term?
Well, I would say, what would it say to all those?
Oh, I see.
You were allowed to continue.
I would say impunity. It's the great definition of our era: impunity, true impunity. I started, people have a lot of questions about my Medium piece and why I chose to do it that way. I wanted to be able to tell my own story. I mean, Chanel Miller, a writer and a woman who experienced tremendous sexual assault. She talks about people picking pine needles out of her hair. I don't want people picking pine needles out of my hair. I want to pick out my own pine needles, symbolically. I think when I started writing my piece, and it took several weeks, I had a line in there that said, I want the governor, he was elected by the people, and he has to see us out of this pandemic. And as the weeks went on, and he retaliated against me, and I saw how he tried to threaten people like Ron Kim, I just took it out. I didn't replace it with something else, because it's not my place to be judge and jury alone. But this is a person who has proven to all of us in plain sight, we have the proof, will continue to abuse his power and will focus that abuse on people who have spoken out against him. I am fearful for the lives of any women who have spoken out against him, particularly his current staffers, if he just gets to sit there. I mean, I watched his press conference yesterday where a reporter asked him what protections are in place for the 2 current staffers against him. And he literally couldn't bring himself to answer appropriately. I suggest people watch this. He literally could not, because he is so focused on abuse of power, and he has been so empowered by impunity. And so I want people to know, whoever needs to know, that I will do whatever I can to make sure there is accountability. And let's separate that from punishment. We're talking about accountability here for not only his abuse, but his abuse of power, trying to destroy women, especially like me, after we've spoken up, to make sure that he can't hurt people he's already hurt, and he can't hurt any more women. And if he doesn't get impeached, he's not going to resign. I know he's not. If he doesn't get impeached, then that will tell all of us that people do not care about abuse of power. They do not care about abuse of power against women. They are okay with impunity if it makes their lives simpler. And that's not what I signed up for in my career. It's not what I signed up for in my life. And it's not what I'm teaching my kid.
When you say that he's not going to resign, you're saying because you know that's the based upon his
I
personal.
worked for this man for 3 years. I mean, I know him better than he knows me. I mean, he looked at women as tools and commodities. So of course he didn't understand us. Of course he underestimated us. Of course he's. But I know who he is. He is not going to resign. He's dug in his heels. He's plotting revenge against people like me, specifically me. And he will have to be impeached to leave his job.
Well, it's going to be very interesting over the next couple of months to see not only what goes on at the legislative level, but also what goes on with the Attorney General,
Yes.
who has opened up an investigation of the issues surrounding Governor Cuomo and his activities. So we're going to follow that. I wanted to collect.
Me too.
So what I want to do just for a moment is take just a short breath here, because I realize that was difficult for you to do. I do want to thank you so much for going through that. It's got to be an enormous challenge for you, but I really respect what you've done.
I chose to put myself in this driver's seat because it was just too important. So I'm okay. Let's do those fun questions if that's what this time is now.
I'm ready for this. Are you ready for the speed round? Because
yes,
you're ready for this.
I'm actually really bad at that. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'll forget my own name. Anyways, go ahead.
Well, I promise speed round's actually not that fast. Let's see what we got. Okay, first of all, Beatles or Rolling Stones?
Rolling Stones.
Rolling Stones.
Sorry. I'm a rock girl. I'm
a rock and roll gal. Okay. If there were one person whose leadership style you'd like to adopt as your own, whose would it be?
That's a good question. Right now, I'm thinking more of people like Jane Jacobs, people who sat and listened and then acted when they heard what their community needed. That's
Okay.
the kind of genre of especially women that I'm interested in following, which is people listen to their community, they show up, and then they carry out responding to the pain points of their community.
Jane Jacobs was quite a leader.
That's why I got into urban planning, because I was inspired by her.
Do you use the term sneakers, tennis shoes, or kicks to describe?
Tennis shoes. I'm from Southern California. Maybe that's a Southern California thing, but tennis shoes for sure.
I believe that there are two types of people in this world: those people who love the television show Schitt's Creek, and those who hate it.
I love that show. I just love that show. I love that show.
Yeah, I have to tell you, Lindsey, it's important that I be honest with you. I stand in opposition to you on Schitt's Creek. It doesn't work for me. I don't find it funny, but I know that there are people who love the show. I just don't get it.
I think it captures something about the crassness of our time and what we talked about earlier with respect to extreme inequality and a reckoning of that. But I do kind of love that show. It makes me laugh.
Okay. Favorite season: spring, summer, winter, fall?
Spring's my favorite season, but my favorite season in New York is probably fall.
Who is your favorite superhero?
Wonder Woman.
What's your favorite at-home family activity?
I love my daughter and I have dance parties. So she's very extroverted. She's going to be, I don't know, some kind of a creator. And so she likes to do these music dance parties that she and I dance to. She's over there right now.
How old is she?
She just turned 7.
Okay, exciting age.
Yeah.
If you had to give up ice cream or pizza, which would it be?
Ice cream. I'm more of a pastry donut person, so ice cream really doesn't do it for me anyways. I would never get up fried dough and cheese and dough, so no.
Yeah, this is going to be a tough question. Which recording artist from your iPhone or whatever, however you keep your music, would we be most surprised to find on your list?
That's a good question. Led Zeppelin? I don't know, because it's not my generation, but I love Led Zeppelin.
Okay,
so it goes back to the Rolling Stones side of the hill, right? Led Zeppelin.
I'm embarrassed to say Led Zeppelin is my generation, but that's good. Okay. And lastly, which is your preferred print news source? You can use up to 3 answers.
New York Times, even if I'm sometimes really frustrated at them. You don't get away from New York Times. I love Teen Vogue. because I think they're right on spot with generational indignation, Teen Vogue.
Well,
Teen
TiVo, okay.
Vogue and
And
feminism and intersectionality. So New York Times, Teen Vogue, and you said 3, right?
I said up to 3, so you can stop at 2.
Okay, I have a third. Washington Post. I mean, so I went to high school, and my love of government really came because I was originally from Southern California, and then I moved to Northern Virginia. I didn't fit in. I would, cut school and go to congressional hearings and get a copy of the Washington Post and just absorb it. So I still love the Post.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Washington Post as well. All right, well, that was their speed round, and that was great. We have a few questions. There are questions that are focusing on the MTA. And Joe Kunzler, I think that's the name, is asking questions about the MTA. Let's talk about the MTA. So let me ask you this first and foremost. Are you an avid subway rider?
Yes.
Do you subway a lot? How can
I mean, right now, I have to say, I feel kind of like a sedentary turtle because what I do is I get out and I walk the city as much as I can. But but yeah, I'm a subway rider. And I bike too. I'm a biker too.
I guess I should have said, have you been in the past? Because most of us are, even if we're using the subway, we're not avid with it.
Yes. I am a subway MTA girl.
So how can we best, our subways have definitely improved from the 1980s. There were times in the 1980s, if you were on a subway after 9, 10 o'clock at night, it was dangerous, really dangerous. But even with the improvements that we've gotten with the subway, there's still much more to be done. As borough president, what priorities would you urge the city and the state to adopt to make our subways a better ride experience for those who use them?
I am someone who believes that the best indicator and leading indication of safety is having people around, right? So having managed public spaces, I was very supportive of the outdoor dining program. Obviously complications, and mainly because restaurants need to stay in business, but also because it's eyes and ears on the street. When we shut down service overnight, when we limit activities, when we have fewer people using mass transit, that's when it becomes the least safe, right? That's the first premise of my experience of the specific kind of urban planning, which is urban public space management. So that's the first precept. So how do we, it needs to be a 24-hour train. It needs critical funding from things like congestion pricing and probably federal aid. I think some of the most important things to do have a lot related to do with mobility and accessibility issues.
About persons with the inability to use stairs, like having.
Or even like when I was with my kid in a stroller, trying to navigate getting in and off the subway is, it's you're taking your life into your hands. And I know that you were asking me about a specific kind of safety issue that is not what I just mentioned, but
no, I'm just asking about which. I use the safety as an example, but talking about accessibility for subway riders, so that they don't have to be carrying these big things down the stairs. People who are suffering from disabilities and can't use the stairs. That's another example, because I think it's something like less than 10% of subways right now have access for people with disabilities.
Like something like 200 or so of the subways don't have operating elevators.
Right.
How can you plan? And something like 1 in 4 people in this city is navigating some sort of a disability. Now, that's not an exact match for the issues that we face in with respect to accessibility on the subway, but how can we not prepare? How can we ever have a successful system that is safe when so many people are excluded from using it in any meaningful way? And I think that actually goes back to the broader safety, because we basically invite people not to take the subway.
Right, and we should.
We say do anything else you can, because we're going to close down overnight, which was had nothing to do with health standards, pandemic safety, coronavirus. It had everything to do with the governor, who controls the MTA based on his board appointments, filled with people who either were my former colleagues or are pawns for the governor. And I could go through each one of those things, but I'm sure my team would be frustrated with me for doing that. But that decision was made to basically prevent people experiencing homelessness from being on the subway at that time. You don't solve a problem by creating another massive one.
Right.
And shutting down, and it's not separate from what we were talking about with libraries. When you cut down stability of access and service, you disincentivize use further, and the problem snowballs. That is what I learned in urban planning, and what I spent years trying to convince the governor to understand, and he's unwilling to, in a broad sense. So I think the best thing we can do is make the subways truly accessible, well lit, things like that, but truly accessible, 24 hours a day, dependable. And frankly, the other thing here is that we lost a real asset when we lost Andy Byford. You asked me that question about kind of public servants, not necessarily politicians, that I really admired, and I had limited interactions with Andy, but he was one of the best. We really lost someone because of this governor's abuse of power and ego in Andy Byford, who cared a lot about transit in this city and cared a lot about New Yorkers, and shame on the governor. And I was working for the state largely for much of that saga playing out. I was working for the governor, and I know it was the governor that did him in. And he's a great example of someone who didn't care about getting credit. He showed up and he listened.
Right.
And boys, there are a lot to hear when you're trying to navigate the city subway system. People have feelings, and they have a lot of feelings because they've gone unheard for a long time. They feel like they have. So he showed up, he listened, and then he didn't stop fighting to help. And I think he's a great example of someone. And we lost him due to governor's abuse of power.
We're well over time, but this
no, I usually do that. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I have one more question that I got that I just want to pass on to you. If you can do it as a yes or no or maybe, that would be great, because we're so far over. But again, this has been a very informative dialogue, so I thank you for there's legislation pending for the City Council called Intro 2186, involving the whole concept of a master urban plan. Just a quick question for you. Do you support it as is?
No. And I think people like Corey Johnson should not go into the business of urban planning unless that's a business that they're choosing to stay in. I think it was completely misguided. I think it was like all the failures of Robert Moses. I totally disagree with it. I think it's a bad idea. And I know very few people who really have a pulse on our communities who support it. No. That was my no.
No, that's okay. Listen, that was really great. As your answers have been so informative. Lindsey, it was so nice to meet you tonight. For those who don't know, Lindsey and I had never spoken before, at least not seen each other before. And it's really a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for lending your time. Dialogue. I'm so looking forward to seeing the comments that come in after the fact, as they often do. I just want to take just a moment, first of all, to wish my sister the very best. She's going through a tough time at the moment. And I hope she pulls through with everything. I'm sure she will. And one last thing, and that is to talk about next week. Next week we have Maya Wiley, who will be who's running for mayor of the city of New York, Democratic candidate. I'm so looking forward to discussing the issues with Maya. Hopefully, Lindsey, you'll tune in as well. And to everyone else, thank you so much for joining us. And again, Lindsey, thank you so much for being here. Thanks again, everybody.